The field glasses hang against Hauptmann Ernst Reinhardt's chest, fogging at the edges where his breath catches them. And through the good lens, he is counting poplars along a tree line near Arracourt that he does not yet know he should fear. It is the morning of the 19th of September, 1944, and the fog off the Moselle sits waist-high across the beet fields of Lorraine. Reinhardt is 31 years old, a company commander in the 5th Panzer Army, a man who fought at Kursk and lived, which in his arm of service is its own kind of credential. He has 42 Panther tanks moving up behind him through the murk. On paper, that is a force that should sweep the thin American line in front of it, back into the Meurthe. He believes the paper. His lead tank commander, a boy named Wenzel from Hamburg, has the hatch open and is riding high in the fog because visibility is nothing, and the Americans, everyone has been told, have little that can kill a Panther from the front. Then Wenzel's tank stops being a tank. There is a flat crack from somewhere in the tree line, no muzzle flash Reinhardt can fix, and the Panther's turret lifts a hand's width off its ring and settles back wrong. A second crack. The hull opens along the seam, and the fog around it goes orange and then black, and Reinhardt is on the ground behind his own vehicle without any memory of having moved. He is looking at a tree line he cannot see into, listening to a gun he cannot locate, and doing the arithmetic that every professional does at the moment his assumptions fail. Something out there killed a 50-ton tank in under 4 seconds, from the flank, from concealment, and it is already traversing to the next one. That is the moment. A captain flat in wet Lorraine mud, watching his confidence come apart, that this whole story turns on. Because Reinhardt survived that day, and that winter he wrote in his diary that of everything the Americans threw at him, one weapon he had come to fear, and it was not the one Berlin kept warning him about. That is the puzzle worth 11 minutes of your time. And it is the reason this channel exists, because the popular story of American armor in Europe is a story about losing. The Sherman that brewed up, the tank that couldn't fight a tiger head-to-head, the crews sent out undergunned. All of that is real, and none of it is the whole picture. And the piece Hollywood leaves out is the piece a frightened German captain wrote down in his own hand. So if you want the war, as the men on the receiving end actually experienced it, told straight and told from the sources, do the thing that keeps these scripts getting made. Like this video, subscribe so the next one finds you, and leave a comment with the unit your own family served in, because I read them, and they shape what I cover next. Now, back to the tree line. Because Reinhardt still does not know what is shooting at him, and the answer is stranger than the fear. What he was looking at, though he could not have named it from the mud, was a machine the American Army barely believed in itself. The gun that killed Wenzel was a 3-inch weapon riding on an open-top chassis called an M18, a vehicle the men who crewed it called the Hellcat. And it had done to that Panther exactly what it was built to do, and nothing. It was built to survive. Here is the thing that made Reinhardt's arithmetic fail. He was hunting for a tank, some armored thing that could take a hit, and there was no tank out there. There was a lightly armored gun carriage that weighed under 20 tons, wore armor a rifle bullet could trouble, and had run to that flanking position at nearly 60 miles an hour, faster than anything Reinhardt owned, faster than most jeeps. It killed his lead vehicle, and then it was simply gone, reversing off its firing position before his gunners could bracket the smoke, and it would reappear 400 meters down the line and do it again. A German officer trained to think in armor and firepower had no category for a thing that traded away its own protection to buy that kind of speed. It offended the doctrine he had been raised on, and it kept killing his tanks. By the end of that day near Arracourt, and across the confused week of tank fighting that followed in the Lorraine fog, the 5th Panzer Army would lose more than 200 armored vehicles to an American force that on paper had no business stopping it. The men doing much of the killing belonged to a branch the American Army itself was already half embarrassed by. A doctrine written before the war by an officer whose ideas most of his own generals thought were wrong. That officer is where the real story starts, 3 years earlier and an ocean away, in an argument inside the United States Army about how you stop a German tank when you have decided, on purpose, not to build a tank to do it. Reinhardt, wiping Lorraine mud from a lens that would not clear, was about to spend the rest of his war being the proof. 2 years earlier, in the summer of 1942, a German tank officer had every reason to think the argument over armor was already settled in his favor. The Mark IV was the heaviest thing most crews had fought in, and it was enough. The Russians had shown up at the gates of Moscow with the T-34, which frightened people for a season, and the German answer to that fright was already rolling off the lines at Nuremberg and Kassel. It had a name that would do a great deal of psychological work over the next 3 years. They called it the Panther. The Panther is why the men who crewed it stopped worrying. Its long 75mm gun, the KWK-42, threw a shell at just over 3,000 feet per second, and at 1,000 meters, it would punch clean through the front of anything the Western Allies were fielding and keep going. Its glacis plate sloped back at 55 degrees under 80 millimeters of steel, which meant an incoming round did not meet armor so much as skid off it. A German gunner in a Panther could sit in a tree line and kill an American tank at a range where the American tank's own gun would bounce off him like gravel off a windshield. That was not propaganda. That was measured on ranges, with instruments, and the numbers were real. The Tiger, heavier still, with its 88, was worse news again, though there were never many of them, and they broke down constantly, a detail the crews complained about and the newsreels left out. Against this, the Germans looked west and saw the Sherman. And they were not impressed. And it is worth being honest that in the summer of 1944, they had earned the right not to be. The M4 Sherman stood tall, almost 10 feet, a wonderful thing to spot from a concealed position. Its early 75mm gun was a fine weapon for blowing up a machine gun nest or a truck, and a poor one for killing a Panther, because at the ranges that mattered, the shell arrived and did nothing. German after-action reports from Normandy noted, with a flatness that reads almost as boredom, that the standard American tank could be engaged and destroyed before it closed to a range where it became dangerous. A panzer commander named Ernst Bachmann would knock out a string of Shermans at a Norman crossroads, and the arithmetic of it made grim sense to everyone in field gray. The word the German crews used for a Sherman that caught fire, and they caught fire readily, was ugly, and I will not translate it kindly. They called it a Tommy Cooker, and then, once the Americans were in it too, a Ronson, after the lighter that lit every time. So the picture in the German mind by the autumn of 1944 was clean and confident, and that confidence is the thing you have to understand before any of what happened at Arracourt makes sense. The gun was superior, the armor was superior, And the optics were superior too, because the Zeiss sights in a Panther were better glass than what the American gunner squinted through. The German assumption was not arrogance in the empty sense. It was an assessment, built from 2 years of killing Shermans at range, and it said that the anti-tank battlefield belonged to the side with the thickest armor and the longest reach, and that side was them. A well-sighted Panther was, tank for tank, the better machine. Almost every man who ever compared them said so, including the Americans. That is the trap the whole German system had walked into, and it is a specific trap, so let me be precise about it. They had concluded that because their tank was better than the American tank, the anti-tank fight was theirs. But the United States Army had looked at the same problem in 1941 and reached a conclusion so different it sounds, at first, like a mistake. The Americans decided they would largely not try to win the tank versus tank duel at all. They would let the Sherman be a tank that supported infantry and exploited breakthroughs, the thing it was actually good at, and they would hand the job of killing German armor to something else entirely. A separate branch, a separate vehicle, a separate doctrine, built around one idea that ran against everything Reinhardt believed about how the battlefield worked. Do not stand and trade armor. Move. Get to the flank. Kill from a place he is not looking, and be gone before he can turn the turret. The German crews never saw that distinction coming, because from inside a Panther it did not exist. A vehicle with tracks and a gun was a tank, and tanks fought the way tanks fought, and they had already proven they were best at it. When the reports began filtering back that autumn, fast, low, open-topped American vehicles appearing on the flank, firing 3 or 4 rounds, killing a Panther, and vanishing before the smoke cleared. The men reading those reports at 5th Panzer Army headquarters filed them under confusion, not doctrine. They assumed it was luck, or a badly handled tank, or a lie told by a crew, explaining how they had lost a 50-ton machine to something that weighed less than half as much. It was none of those. It was on purpose, and the man who had made it on purpose had spent the previous 3 years being told by his own army that he was wrong. Lieutenant General Lesley McNair had spent the interwar years staring at a problem most of his peers preferred to wave away, and the answer he arrived at was radical enough that it made him enemies inside his own building. McNair ran Army ground forces, which meant he decided, more than any other single man, what the American soldier would carry into Europe. He looked at the German Blitz through France in 1940 and drew a lesson that offended the tankers. Tanks, he decided, should not fight tanks. A tank that had to stop and duel enemy armor was a tank not doing its real job, which was to tear through the rear and run. The killing of enemy tanks belonged to a specialist, a hunter, and McNair wanted that hunter built around one principle he stated so plainly it became branch doctrine. Seek out the enemy armor, strike from ambush, do not slug it out. The branch he created for it was called Tank Destroyer Command, and it got its own school at Camp Hood in Texas, its own shoulder patch, a black cat crushing a tank in its jaws, and its own motto, seek, strike, destroy. The first machine that tried to carry the idea was the M10, and it was a compromise everyone could see. They took the Sherman hull, dropped in a 3-inch gun, and gave it an open-top turret with sloped but thin sides. The open top was not an oversight. It was doctrine made metal. A tank destroyer crew was supposed to see everything, hear everything, spot the enemy first and shoot first, and a closed roof blinds you and deafens you. The M10 could kill a Panzer IV all day. Against a Panther's frontal armor at range, it had the same problem the Sherman did. The shell arrived and skidded, and the men who crewed it knew it. Its turret traversed by hand, slow, a crank turned by a sweating loader, which in a fight measured in seconds was a defect that got men killed. Then, in 1943, came the machine that turned the doctrine from an argument into a weapon. The M18 Hellcat was built from a clean sheet by Buick, and it was the fastest tracked armored vehicle any nation fielded in the entire war, a record it still holds. It weighed under 20 tons. Its Continental radial engine and torsion bar suspension pushed it to roughly 55 miles an hour on a road, and there is a wartime test figure of it, touching 60 on a hard surface with the governor off. Think about what that speed actually buys a crew. A Panther gunner acquires the Hellcat, begins his lay, and in the seconds that takes the Hellcat, has already moved 100 yards, and the firing solution is garbage. Its turret was powered, fast, and it carried the same 3-inch gun as the M10, but on a platform that could sprint to a flank, fire, and be reversing off the position before the smoke lifted. The armor was almost nothing, a half-inch in places, thin enough that the crews knew a single hit anywhere meant the vehicle burned. They accepted that trade. Speed was the armor. If you are never where the shell is aimed, you do not need the steel. The M18's gun barked with a sharp, flat crack rather than the deep cough of a bigger weapon, and the crews worked it in a specific rhythm, fire, and the whole light hull rocks back on its torsion bars, the spent case clanging into the bin at the loader's knee, the smell of it filling an open turret with a bitter ammoniac sting that clung to a man's collar for hours. 3 rounds in under 15 seconds from a good crew. Then the driver already had it moving before the 3rd case hit the floor. But even the Hellcat had the same gun, and the gun was the thing that still could not reliably punch a Panther head-on. So the 3rd machine solved the last piece, the M36. Jackson took a heavier turret and mounted the 90mm gun, the same caliber as the American heavy anti-aircraft weapon, adapted to fire armor-piercing shot flat and hard. That gun would go through a Panther's frontal plate at ranges where the 75 had only bounced. When the Jacksons reached the line in numbers in the autumn and winter of 1944, the last German advantage in the anti-tank fight, the sense that a Panther facing you head-on was safe, quietly evaporated. A German crew that had been taught the Sherman shell could not reach them met a low, fast, open-top shape that reached them fine. The 90mm round, arriving through the glacis, did not skid. It went in. So look at what McNair's doctrine actually produced by the time it collided with Reinhardt in the Lorraine fog. Not one machine, but a system, and each piece paid for the weakness of the last. From the M10 came the sloped ambush turret. The Hellcat added the impossible speed that made the ambush unfair, and the Jackson finally brought the gun that ended the argument the 75 could not. All 3 were built around a single refusal, the refusal to fight the fight the German wanted, armor against armor, at the range the German chose. Every one of them was designed to shoot from where he was not looking and be gone before he turned. The German after-action reports, when they finally admitted what was happening to them, used a word for it. They called the American tank destroyers very dangerous, their word. That admission, and the terror underneath it, is where we go next. The tank destroyers, of which the enemy had large numbers, proved very effective. That line comes from a foreign military studies report written after the war by a German general for the United States Army, and it deserves a moment because of what it does not say. It never mentions tigers, and it never mentions the tank duels that fill every documentary and every movie. Asked to explain how his armor was being destroyed in the West, a professional soldier reached first for the open-topped hunters, and popular history has spent 80 years reaching for something else. Here is the myth, and you have seen it before. American armor in Europe is the story of the poor Sherman crew sent to die against the invincible tiger. 5 Shermans traded for every German cat. Brave men in bad tanks winning by sheer weight of numbers. Almost none of that survives contact with the records. Start with the tiger itself, the animal at the center of the legend. Germany built about 1,350 Tiger Is and fewer than 500 of the heavier Tiger IIs, and most of them went east into the furnace against the Soviets, where the German army was being bled white. The number an American tank crew in France was likely to meet was small. What they actually fought, day after day in the hedgerows and across the Lorraine plain, was the Panzer IV and the Panther and the towed anti-tank gun dug into a hedge. The tiger was terrifying, and it was rare, and the myth has kept the terror while quietly forgetting the rare. Sources conflict on exactly how many tigers ever faced the Western Allies at all, but the honest figure is a fraction of the thing the legend implies. Now the harder number, the one that dismantles the whole picture. Who was actually killing German tanks in the European theater? Not the Sherman, mostly. The United States Army's own studies after the war, the ones with the tables and the cold columns, kept turning up an answer that embarrassed nobody more than the tank arm itself. A very large share of German armor destroyed by American ground weapons was destroyed by the tank destroyer battalions and by towed anti-tank guns, by McNair's specialists, doing exactly the job the doctrine had carved out for them. The branch the Army was already half ashamed of, the branch that would be abolished within 2 years of the war ending, was carrying the anti-armor fight in the West. The workhorse of the American war against the panzer was not the machine on the movie poster. Think about how strange that is, as a piece of forgetting. The weapon that did the most work got the least memory. And the weapon that got the memory, the Sherman, gallant and burning, was, in the anti-tank role, the junior partner. Part of that is simple. There were far more Shermans than tank destroyers. They were everywhere. They carried the infantry and took the ground, and appeared in every photograph, so the story attached itself to them. Part of it is that our tank was outmatched and we won anyway, is a better campfire story than we built a specialist gun carriage that ambushed their armor from the flank and killed it efficiently. Efficiency does not make legends, sacrifice does. But there is a cost to the pretty version, and the cost is that it gets the enemy's experience exactly backwards. Reinhardt, flat in the Lorraine mud, was not afraid of a Sherman. He had killed Shermans. His crews had killed Shermans at ranges where the American gun was a rumor. What put him on the ground behind his own tank was the thing the myth erases, the fast, low 3-inch and 90mm hunters that were never supposed to be in a stand-up fight and never tried to be. The German records know this, even when the popular histories do not. When you read the after-action reports and the interrogations and the studies those captured generals wrote for their American captors, the tank destroyer keeps surfacing, described with a respect the Sherman rarely earns. The men on the receiving end were better historians of what hurt them than we have been. And this is the second larger point, the one that closes the loop McNair opened. The doctrine that everyone inside the American army distrusted. The doctrine that said, do not build a better tank, build a hunter that refuses the duel, was being vindicated in real time, in German, in the enemy's own paperwork. The tank officers who wanted a heavier Sherman were not wrong that a heavier Sherman would have been nice, but McNair had bet on a different answer to the same question. And when a German general sat down after his surrender to explain how his armor had been ground down in the West, the answer he wrote was, in effect, McNair's answer read back to him, very effective. Large numbers. The enemy validating the doctrine its own creators had been arguing about for 3 years. So the question stops being, why was the Sherman so bad? That question was always a little dishonest, and it flatters our appetite for a tragedy. The real question is, the one Reinhardt was about to spend the winter of 1944 writing into a private diary in his own hand, and it is sharper than any myth. Not why did the American tank lose the duel, but why did the German who survived come to fear the American weapon that never fought one? The fog burns off slowly at Arracourt, and by a little after 8 in the morning on the 19th of September, 1944, the Panthers of the 113th Panzer Brigade are moving through it half-blind, engines loud, hulls swimming waist-deep in white. Reinhardt's crews cannot see 200 meters. They can hear each other, and they can hear their own tracks, and that is nearly all. The Hellcats of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion can hear them too. That is the thing the fog gave the Americans and took from the Germans, and it flipped the whole assessment of Section 2 on its head in the space of a morning. Everything the German had banked on, the long gun, the good Zeiss glass, the ability to kill at 1,000 meters where the Sherman was a rumor. All of it required seeing the enemy first, at range, across open ground. The fog erased range. It dragged the fight down to 50, 100, 150 meters, into the exact knife work where a light, fast, open-topped hunter that heard you before you saw it held every card in the deck. Lieutenant Edwin Leiper put his platoon of M18s along a low rise near the village of Lesley and waited for the sound. What happened next is in the after-action reports, and it reads less like a battle than a demonstration. A column of German tanks passed across Leiper's front in the mist, close, unaware. His gunners fired at ranges where the 3-inch gun did not need to argue with a Panther's frontal armor because it was not shooting at the frontal armor. It was shooting into flanks and running gear at 150 yards where the thin side plate opened like a can. One Hellcat crew, the reports credit them, knocked out several Panthers from a single position in minutes, then moved, fire, and move. The whole doctrine, the thing McNair had been mocked for, executed in fog by a lieutenant and 4 crews of 20-year-olds. You have to picture the specific helplessness of the German inside that. A Panther gunner hears the flat crack to his right, feels the hull ring as a round goes home somewhere aft, and begins to traverse the turret toward the threat. The turret is powered, but the Panther's traverse is geared to the engine, and it is not fast, and by the time the long 75 has come around to where the shot came from, there is nothing there. Torn beet field. Settling smoke. The Hellcat that fired it is already 60, 80 yards away, at a speed no tank on that field could match, relaying, and the second shot comes from the new angle before the German has finished correcting for the first. He is fighting a thing that will not stand where he points his gun. He was trained his whole war to win the duel, and the American has simply refused to hold still long enough to have one. The exhaust bit at the back of the throat, cordite and hot oil and churned wet earth, and inside an open Hellcat turret, the loader worked shells with the smell of the last one still hanging over him, brass ringing into the bin, the driver's boot already easing the vehicle back off the rise before the gunner called the hit. From the winning side, the doctrine was noise and speed. A horizon you kept changing on purpose. By the end of the Arracourt fighting, spread across days of this, the arithmetic had inverted the confident picture of 1942 completely. The German brigades that came to pinch off the American flank lost the bulk of their armor. American tank destroyer and armor losses were a fraction of the German. The 5th Panzer Army's counterstroke, launched by a force with the better tanks on paper, broke against a smaller force that had chosen not to fight fair. Here is the second quote, and it is worth the wait, because it is the German High Command trying to explain the inexplicable to itself. The War Diary of Army Group G, assessing the failure in Lorraine, blamed the poor training of the new Panzer brigades and the skill of the American defense. Hasso von Manteuffel, who commanded 5th Panzer Army, put it more plainly after the war. The American was more elastic, he said, and better able to improvise. Elastic. From a Prussian professional, describing the thing that beat him, that word is an admission. He is reaching for why armor superiority did not translate into victory, and the answer he lands on is not steel. It is how the Americans fought. The refusal to be fixed, the willingness to move, the doctrine that treated position as something you spent rather than held. Reinhardt survived Arracourt. Most of his brigade's tanks did not. The records do not give us the precise moment he began to understand what had happened to him, and I will not invent one. The diary that opened this story does the understanding for him, over the weeks that followed, in his own careful hand. What he had met in the fog was not a better tank. He knew tanks, and he had beaten the American tank many times. What he had met was a weapon built on the opposite of everything he believed a tank fight was, crewed by men who had been handed a machine with no armor and told that speed and surprise would keep them alive, and who had proven it against the best armor Germany could field. The thing that frightened him had never once tried to trade blows with him. It had simply killed his tanks and driven away. Reinhardt writes the entry in the second week of October, 1944, in a hand that a man who has read a lot of his other pages can tell is not steady. He does not describe a battle. He describes a sound and the space where a gun should have been and was not. The tank destroyer, he writes, is the enemy one cannot find. That is the sentence that gives this whole story its title, and it is worth sitting with what kind of man wrote it. A professional, a gunner who had killed at 1,000 meters and trusted the killing. By the autumn of 1944, he has stopped trusting the one thing his whole training was built on, which is that the enemy who shoots at you can be located, ranged, and answered. He was not alone in that, and this is where the private diary stops being one frightened man and becomes a pattern the German army was writing down all across the Western Front. The foreign military studies are full of it once you know to look. General after general, sitting in American captivity after the war, asked to reconstruct why the campaign in the West went the way it did, and reaching, unprompted, repeatedly, for the tank destroyer and the American gun they never saw fire. One report calls the American anti-tank defense extraordinarily flexible. Another describes German tank crews growing reluctant to advance into open ground in daylight, not because of the Sherman in front of them, but because of what might be waiting, hull down and invisible, on either flank. The word that keeps surfacing in the translations is not powerful, it is surprise. They were not being beaten by a heavier machine. They were being beaten by not knowing where the shot came from, over and over, until the not knowing became its own kind of wound. And then there is Fort Hunt. On a piece of ground in Virginia, the Americans called Post Office Box 1142, captured German officers were housed in comfortable rooms and encouraged to talk to one another, and the rooms were wired. The prisoners knew, in a general way, that they should be careful. Most of the time they forgot, because men who have survived something need to tell someone, and the man in the next bunk was German and safe and understood. So they talked, and the microphones ran, and the transcripts sit in the record now, with a candor no interrogation ever produced. In them, you can hear panzermen describe the American tank destroyer the way you would describe a thing that hunts you. Not with the professional contempt they kept for the Sherman, with something closer to respect, and under the respect, fear. That is the trust anchor of this whole story, and it matters why. A man lying to his interrogator flatters the enemy to explain his own defeat. A man who does not know he is being recorded, talking to a comrade, has no reason to inflate the thing that beat him. When those men called the American gun what they called it, they were telling the truth to the only audience they thought was listening. Now go back 3 years and stand next to Lesley McNair inside the argument. He had told the tank arm they were wrong. He had built a branch on a principle every instinct of armored warfare rejected, that the answer to a better tank was not a better tank, but a hunter that refused the duel entirely. They gave his branch a black cat and a school in Texas, and mostly their skepticism. They abolished it within 2 years of the war's end, folded it away as an idea that had outlived its moment. What comes next is the part worth weighing. The men who wrote the truest testimony to McNair's doctrine were not American officers defending a program. They were German generals in captivity and German captains in wired rooms, describing, in their own language, exactly the weapon he said to build and exactly the terror he said it would produce. The doubter was proven right by the enemy. There is no cleaner vindication in the archive of the war than that. McNair did not live to read it. He was killed on the 25th of July, 1944, near St. Lo, standing in a forward position when American heavy bombers dropped short during Operation Cobra and their own bombs fell on their own lines. He died under American ordnance in a French field, weeks before the machines his doctrine built did their finest work at Arracourt. He never saw the diary, and he never heard the wiretaps. The man who bet everything on the invisible gun did not live to learn the enemy had learned to fear it exactly as he promised. Reinhardt survived the war. The records I have do not follow him past the spring of 1945, and I am not going to manufacture an ending the file does not give me. What survives is the entry, and the entry is enough. He had begun this story counting poplars through good German glass on a September morning. A confident man in the better tank, waiting in the fog for an enemy he expected to see coming. What he met instead came from the flank, killed, and was gone before his turret could answer. And it did that to him again and again, until a professional soldier sat down and wrote, in a hand that would not hold steady, that the weapon he feared most was the one he could never find. He was right to fear it. It was built on purpose to never let him look at it twice. The Germans never built an answer to it. That is the fact that closes the account, and it is worth stating flatly before anything else, because it is the part that separates the tank destroyer from every other American advantage the Wehrmacht met and adapted to. They studied the Sherman and outgunned it. When they met American artillery, they learned to dig, to move at night, to disperse. The fighter bombers taught them their own drills: travel the ditches, post air sentries, freeze when the engine note came over the ridge. The German army was, right to the end, one of the fastest learning military organizations on earth, and it countered almost everything thrown at least part way, at least on paper. It never countered the thing that killed Reinhardt's brigade. You can go looking for the German doctrinal fix, the memo that says, here is how we defeat the fast open-topped hunter, and you will not find it. Because the problem the tank destroyer posed was not a problem of steel that a heavier plate or a longer gun could solve. It was a problem of information. The German tank fight, the whole magnificent edifice of it, rested on a single assumption so deep that no one in the panzer arm thought to write it down: that the enemy who fires at you is a thing you can find. You range him, traverse to him, answer him, win the exchange because your gun is better and your glass is better and your crew is better, which, often, they were. McNair had reached under that assumption and pulled it out. The weapon he built did not try to survive the exchange. It refused to have the exchange at all. It fired from the flank at a range where armor thickness stopped mattering, and then it was somewhere else before the traverse came around, and the German gunner spent his war correcting for a shot that came from a place the enemy had already left. There is no counter to that inside the logic of a tank duel, because it is not a tank duel. It is the negation of one. And a professional army trained to win duels found itself in the fields of Lorraine, playing a game whose rules it had never agreed to and could not change. Think about what the enemy's own words admit: laid end to end. Very effective. Large numbers. Extraordinarily flexible. More elastic. The enemy one cannot find. Not one of those phrases describes a better tank. Every one of them describes a method, a way of fighting, a refusal, and the men reaching for them were the men on the receiving end, the ones with the most reason to want a simpler explanation and the least reason to invent this one. When a Prussian general credits the American with being elastic, he is not praising a machine. He is confessing that he was beaten by how the other man thought. That is the vindication, and it belongs to a dead man who never collected it. McNair lost the bureaucratic war, even as his doctrine won the real one. The tank destroyer branch was dissolved in 1946, the Black Cat retired, the school in Texas closed, the whole idea filed away as a wartime expedient that peace had made obsolete. The Army went back to the thing it had always wanted, the main battle tank that did its own hunting, and in a sense, the skeptics got the future they preferred. But that is a separate argument about a separate war. In the war, McNair actually fought, on the ground where it actually happened. The enemy sat in captivity and in wired rooms and told the truth about which American weapon had frightened him. And it was not the one on the poster. It was the one McNair had been mocked for building. Here is what I keep coming back to, and I will give it to you plainly because the sources let me. The most persuasive evidence that a weapon works is not the manual that promises it will. It is not the after-action report written by the men who fired it, proud of their own morning's work. It is the enemy, in his own language, with no one he trusts listening, describing the shape of his own fear. Reinhardt gave us that. Not a boast, not an American claim that the American thing was good, but a German gunner with a steady career of kills behind him, writing in a hand that would not hold the pen straight, about the sound of a gun he could never place. Go back to the fog one last time. Feel the cold of it against the face, the wet that beads on the field glasses and blurs the tree line Reinhardt is counting, the diesel and the churned beet earth thick in the throat. Somewhere out in that white, a light hull is idling, low, its crew listening to his tracks, and the first thing Reinhardt will know of it is a flat crack from the flank and the hull ringing under his feet. By the time his turret swings, the field will be empty. He will do this again. He will keep doing it until the pen shakes. You have sat with the man who feared it and the man who built it, and you know now which weapon the Wehrmacht could not answer and which one got the movies. The recorder at Fort Hunt is still running. A German captain leans toward the man in the next bunk, lowers his voice, and starts to explain how they died.